Fewer than 15% of known viral pathogens were formally cataloged before the 1940s, leaving large gaps in scientific awareness. The story of what was hidden and why spans decades, crossing laboratories, military doctrine, and public health, tracing a path from discovery to concealment and the shadows it left on society. It began with a problem of visibility. Emerging diseases appeared suddenly, sometimes lethal, often misunderstood. Governments and medical institutions struggled to respond, both because the science was incomplete and because political stakes were high. Lesser-known fact, design compromise. Early containment labs lacked negative pressure airflow, leading to partial leaks of bacterial cultures during experimental trials in multiple countries. The parents of concealment were a combination of state security, industrial priorities, and scientific ambition. Laboratories tasked with identifying pathogens were also tasked with classifying their threat, often in the absence of international standards. The tension between openness and secrecy defined the early years. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. During the Cold War, many governments classified pathogen research as strategic intelligence, equating biological hazards with conventional weapons in terms of security priority. Early prototypes of concealment were bureaucratic. Diseases were cataloged internally, sometimes misnamed or omitted from public records. Classification systems were inconsistent. Data sharing across borders was minimal, hampering global awareness. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Limited refrigeration and transport infrastructure in the 1930s caused spoilage of over 20% of pathogen samples before formal study could occur. Childhood of the hidden disease doctrine was chaotic. Misunderstandings were frequent. Medical personnel trained on outdated or incomplete data. Early outbreaks were poorly recorded, often dismissed as routine illnesses. Lesser-known fact, medical/psychological effect. Misdiagnosis during early outbreaks contributed to heightened mortality rates as treatment protocols were delayed or misapplied. Training realities shaped human response. Laboratory staff were instructed in secrecy, not just safety. Mistakes could become politically sensitive. The burden of knowledge weighed unevenly. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Biosafety officers in early high-containment labs underwent minimal formalized instruction, learning primarily through on-the-job mentorship, increasing risk of accidental exposure. Small adjustments made large differences. Improved labeling of samples, standardized logbooks, and controlled circulation of reports gradually introduced order, yet these changes were hidden from public view, creating an invisible infrastructure. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. Restricted access to pathogen repositories was later found to reduce accidental dissemination by approximately 40%, though it also limited legitimate research collaboration. Growth of the system occurred alongside scientific advances. High containment labs were built, manuals formalized procedures, standardized shipping crates, biohazard labeling, and temperature-controlled transport improved reliability. Lesser-known fact, supply constraint. Post-WW2 shortages of autoclaves and sterilization equipment delayed operational readiness in several emerging laboratories for up to 2 years. Mass production of knowledge was constrained by politics. Some pathogens were actively withheld from public reporting to prevent panic or protect national security. Internal catalogs grew, but outward communication was selective. Lesser-known fact, test result. Analysis of declassified government archives shows that up to 35% of disease incidents in the 1950s were not publicly reported at the time, even when significant outbreaks occurred. As it matured, the hidden disease doctrine became procedural. Documentation was meticulous but selective. Laboratories were networked through classified channels, and redundancy ensured preservation despite accidents. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Duplicate samples were stored across 3 separate facilities to mitigate the risk of destruction, but inconsistent labeling caused retrieval errors in at least 12% of cases. Peak effectiveness occurred when secrecy and containment aligned perfectly. In one notable outbreak, a novel hemorrhagic virus was isolated, studied in controlled conditions, and withheld from general publication for years. The pathogen could have sparked public fear, yet its presence was managed internally with limited exposure. Lesser-known fact, battlefield improvisation. During the 1960s, some military units developed mobile quarantine setups to study pathogens under field conditions without alerting civilian populations. Why did this work? Because secrecy amplified control. Data was centralized, exposure minimized, and risk perception managed. Only those in the inner network knew the true scope, and that knowledge guided both response and policy. Lesser-known fact, psychological effect. Staff exposed to classified disease data experienced measurable stress responses, with elevated cortisol levels reported in 27% of individuals during containment exercises. The cost was human and societal. Public health decisions were constrained by incomplete information. Policymakers acted with partial understanding, often relying on assumptions rather than complete data. Lesser-known fact, medical/psychological effect. Delayed reporting of emerging diseases increased morbidity in affected regions by estimated margins of 15 to 25% due to delayed interventions. Fatigue affected both personnel and systems. Lab workers endured long hours under strict biosafety rules. Decision-making was high stakes, with political oversight adding pressure. Mistakes could have amplified consequences. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Overwork in high containment labs was linked to procedural violations, sometimes leading to near-miss contamination incidents. Old age arrived as transparency slowly increased. Declassification programs, international collaboration, and epidemiological studies exposed previously hidden pathogens. Technology allowed rapid detection, genetic sequencing, and public health integration, reducing the utility of concealment. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. The introduction of PCR testing in the 1980s cut detection time for many pathogens from weeks to hours, undermining the previous reliance on controlled secrecy. The decline was uneven. Some pathogens remained classified for decades, while others entered public awareness rapidly. The rise of global health organizations, digital reporting, and real-time surveillance shifted strategy from concealment to mitigation. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. By the late 20th century, WHO guidelines prioritized transparency and rapid reporting over national control, reflecting a doctrinal reversal in global public health policy. Legacy endures in multiple forms. Protocols for secure handling, transport, and study of dangerous pathogens remain foundational. Military and civilian systems alike learned the consequences of both overexposure and underreporting. Lesser-known fact, design compromise. Modern BSL-4 laboratories balance containment with accessibility for authorized personnel, reducing accidental isolation failures while maintaining security. The moral of this story is subtle but powerful. Knowledge of diseases carries responsibility, and concealment, while sometimes strategic, has costs beyond what is immediately visible. Communities, scientists, and policymakers all live in the shadow of hidden pathogens, and the ripple effects of secrecy persist long after the initial act. Lesser-known fact, psychological studies suggest that awareness of historical disease concealment can increase public trust in proactive transparency by up to 40%, highlighting the importance of lessons learned. The biography of hidden disease is therefore a biography of systems, laboratories, doctrines, personnel, and policies. It is a story of containment, of fear, of strategy, and of the delicate balance between knowledge and disclosure. Its life teaches that the unseen can be as powerful as the seen, and what is withheld often shapes the course of societies more profoundly than what is revealed.
Estimates suggest that as late as the 1960s, over 60% of documented viral outbreaks were reported internally to government agencies, but never communicated publicly. The story of hidden diseases is not merely one of pathogens, but of information itself, how it was controlled, manipulated, and weaponized, leaving a complex trail through decades of laboratories, bureaucracies, and quiet ethical debates. Its birth was rooted in dual pressures: scientific curiosity and political control. Researchers raced to catalog new pathogens, while governments weighed the risk of public panic. Laboratories sprouted across continents, each a node in a network of secrecy. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Early negative pressure lab designs sometimes allowed microscopic aerosol leaks under high humidity, a flaw noted but unreported in internal assessments. The parents of concealment were multiple: industry seeking vaccines, military strategists assessing biological threats, and public health officials managing limited resources. Collaboration existed in theory, but was fragmented by national security concerns. Lesser-known fact: command doctrine shift. Biological research was often classified alongside nuclear and chemical programs, placing pathogens into strategic categories typically reserved for weapons. Early prototypes of the system relied on selective reporting and compartmentalization. Disease registries were incomplete. Some samples were deliberately mislabeled or stored without reference to active research. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Temperature-controlled storage was inconsistent, resulting in accidental degradation of up to 15% of critical bacterial samples in the 1940s. Childhood of the doctrine was marked by trial and error. Scientists encountered pathogens they could not fully understand, and governments faced outbreaks they could not explain publicly. Early failures included misidentification of disease vectors, underestimation of contagion, and delayed interventions. Lesser-known fact: test result. Studies of influenza outbreaks during the 1950s showed that internal reports underestimated spread by an average of 28%, partly due to selective documentation. Training realities shaped the human response. Lab personnel learned not just techniques, but discretion. Public-facing reports were curated to minimize alarm. Even small misstatements could provoke scrutiny or scandal. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Personnel handling live viral cultures were often rotated monthly to reduce the psychological strain of secrecy, though continuity of knowledge sometimes suffered. Small procedural changes had outsized effects. Improved logbooks, clearer chain of custody procedures, and temperature monitoring systems reduced internal errors while maintaining secrecy. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. Tightened access controls to pathogen storage reduced accidental exposure incidents by roughly 37% in early field laboratories. As the system matured, logistics became critical. Transport of pathogens required secure containers, reliable cold chains, and careful scheduling. Even small delays could compromise both safety and control of information. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. During the 1950s, inadequate availability of dry ice and refrigerated shipping crates caused frequent sample degradation, forcing multiple redundancies. Standardization emerged alongside bureaucratic expansion. Manuals defined handling protocols, classification tiers, and internal reporting. Centralized repositories stored duplicates in case of accident or destruction. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Duplicate sample storage sometimes led to mislabeling, resulting in confusion over identical strains and delayed experiments by months. The peak of the doctrine was as much psychological as operational. In one documented scenario, a hemorrhagic fever virus was contained in a single facility with access restricted to a handful of trusted researchers. Public awareness was nil. Response coordination and containment were centralized. Lesser-known fact: medical/psychological effect. Staff in high-secrecy labs exhibited measurable stress responses, including increased heart rate and disrupted sleep during periods of pathogen handling and outbreak anticipation. Why it worked was clear. The combination of physical containment and information suppression reduced public panic while maintaining strategic control. Knowledge existed, but only where it was deemed necessary. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. Internal simulation exercises demonstrated that controlled dissemination of pathogen data reduced accidental exposure by up to 42% compared with fully public reporting. The cost of concealment was immense. Societies endured outbreaks without full understanding. Mortality rose in regions where diseases were unreported or misclassified. Public health planning suffered. Lesser-known fact, medical/psychological effect. Delays in reporting dengue and typhoid outbreaks in mid-20th century Southeast Asia led to excess mortality estimates ranging from 10 to 15% above baseline. Personnel bore a personal burden. Fatigue from constant vigilance, fear of exposure, and the moral tension of withholding information shaped careers and lives. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Long-term staff in classified pathogen programs reported elevated incidence of anxiety disorders compared to peers in non-classified labs, according to retrospective surveys. Old age of the doctrine arrived as global health infrastructure improved. Rapid detection technologies, genetic sequencing, and international reporting standards made concealment increasingly impractical. Public health networks emphasized transparency and mitigation. Lesser-known fact, test result. By the 1990s, automated disease surveillance cut reporting delays from weeks to days, undermining the feasibility of long-term concealment. Decline was uneven. Some pathogens remained classified decades longer, often for national security reasons. Others entered public awareness rapidly due to leaks or scientific publication. The effectiveness of secrecy diminished as networks of information became more interconnected. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. WHO and CDC policies shifted in the late 19th century to prioritize rapid reporting and containment over national secrecy, formalizing a global transparency framework. Legacy persisted in protocols, equipment, and policy. Biosafety levels, secure storage, and restricted access procedures remain critical today. Militaries and public health organizations learned the costs of both concealment and disclosure. Lesser-known fact, design compromise. Modern BSL-4 labs balance containment with operational accessibility, reducing accidental exposure while allowing authorized research. The quiet moral line is evident. Knowledge, when withheld, can protect but also endanger. Communities, governments, and scientists all navigate the tension between transparency and control. Lesser-known fact, psychological studies show that public understanding of past concealment increases trust in modern transparency measures, highlighting lessons learned from the hidden disease era. In the end, the biography of hidden diseases is not about the pathogens alone, but the systems that managed, controlled, and sometimes suppressed knowledge. Its lifespans, discovery, secrecy, adaptation, and eventual integration into modern public health frameworks. It teaches that information itself can be as powerful as any physical threat, and that the cost of hiding truth is measured in both human lives and the enduring shadow it casts on society. By the early 2000s, more than 120 countries had agreed, at least on paper, to notify international bodies of unusual disease outbreaks within 24 hours. That single requirement marked a turning point in the life of concealment, shifting it from a dominant doctrine into something increasingly constrained by systems built to expose it. In its later years, the practice did not disappear, it adapted. Governments no longer relied on complete silence, but on delay, framing, and selective disclosure. Information moved, but not always at the same speed as the disease itself. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift.
Revised international health regulations introduced mandatory reporting timelines, yet compliance audits found delays of 48 to 72 hours in up to 30% of initial outbreak notifications. The mechanism became subtler. Early case counts were sometimes reported conservatively, labeled as suspected rather than confirmed. Language replaced absence as a tool. The structure of communication shaped perception. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Case definition criteria are often intentionally strict at the start of an outbreak, which can undercount early cases by 20 to 40% until diagnostic capacity expands. Training evolved alongside scrutiny. Public health officials were now taught how to communicate uncertainty without triggering panic. Press briefings became part of the system, as important as laboratory work. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Risk communication training programs introduced after major outbreaks improved public compliance with health measures by up to 25% when messaging was consistent and transparent. Technology accelerated everything. Digital reporting systems, genomic sequencing, and real-time dashboards reduced the space in which concealment could operate. Independent researchers, hospitals, and even individuals contributed data. The network widened beyond control of any single authority. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. Open-source epidemiology platforms have identified outbreaks days before official announcements in several documented cases, narrowing the window for delayed disclosure. At its peak tension in this phase, concealment and transparency collided. A cluster of unexplained illnesses appears. Local authorities investigate quietly. Meanwhile, external signals, hospital admissions, online reports, laboratory anomalies begin to surface. The system strains under competing pressures. Lesser-known fact: test result. Retrospective analyses of outbreak timelines show that unofficial indicators can precede formal recognition by 5 to 10 days, depending on surveillance quality. Why did concealment persist at all? Because uncertainty carries risk. Early data is incomplete, often contradictory. Premature disclosure can cause panic, economic disruption, or misdirected response. Decision-makers weigh these outcomes in real time. Lesser-known fact: medical psychological effect. Public panic responses during health scares can increase hospital visits by up to 200% for non-critical symptoms, overwhelming systems before actual case surges occur. But the cost of delay remained measurable. Even short gaps between detection and disclosure affected containment. Transmission chains extended quietly, often invisibly. The mathematics of spread does not wait for confirmation. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. Delayed recognition of outbreaks can lead to shortages of protective equipment within days, as demand spikes suddenly without prior distribution planning. Fatigue shifted from laboratory isolation to system-wide strain. Healthcare workers, analysts, and administrators faced continuous pressure, balancing accuracy with urgency. The demand for real-time answers rarely aligned with the pace of verification. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Fatigue among epidemiological teams during prolonged outbreaks has been linked to increased data entry errors, sometimes affecting case counts by several percentage points. The psychological burden expanded beyond specialists. Populations, now connected through constant information flow, experienced cycles of alert and uncertainty. Trust became a variable, built slowly, lost quickly. Lesser-known fact: medical psychological effect. Studies show that inconsistent health messaging can reduce public trust by over 30%, directly impacting adherence to safety guidelines. Old age of the doctrine did not arrive as disappearance, but as dilution.
Concealment could no longer function as a primary strategy. It became a temporary condition within a larger system of disclosure. The window for secrecy narrowed. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. Widespread use of rapid diagnostic tests has reduced the time between symptom onset and confirmation to less than 24 hours for many diseases, limiting opportunities for prolonged suppression. Replacement came in layers. Transparency frameworks, independent verification, and global data sharing agreements formed a network that resisted complete control. Even when information was delayed, it was rarely absent for long. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Early global reporting systems struggled with incompatible data formats, delaying integration across countries until standardized digital protocols were introduced. The doctrine's final phase is visible in its remnants. Delays, cautious language, incomplete early data. These are echoes of its earlier form, but they exist within a structure that trends toward exposure rather than concealment. Lesser-known fact, weather-terrain impact. Remote regions with limited connectivity still experience reporting delays of several days, showing that geography can preserve older patterns of information control. Its legacy is complex and still unfolding. Modern public health systems carry both the lessons of secrecy and the demands of openness. Protocols now aim to balance accuracy, speed, and public understanding. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. Current global health strategy emphasizes early warning, rapid response, a reversal of earlier priorities that favored controlled information flow. What was learned is not simple. Concealment can buy time, but it also costs time. It can stabilize perception, but destabilize reality. Systems built to hide knowledge eventually confront systems built to reveal it. Lesser-known fact, test result. Comparative studies of outbreak responses show that early transparent reporting reduces overall case numbers by measurable margins, sometimes as much as 20 to 30%, depending on disease characteristics. And so the life of this doctrine closes not with an ending, but with a boundary. It still exists, but only in fragments, constrained by faster science, wider networks, and a public that expects to know. The diseases were never truly hidden forever. They were delayed, reframed, contained within systems that could only hold them for so long. The final measure is quiet, not in what was concealed, but in how long it remained so, and what changed once it was no longer possible.